In this tutorial, we will look at how to adapt the system if a need arises to change the way in which health of the employees and hours worked by the employees are tracked. Until this moment, the hours worked by a group of crews were recorded like this. The starting time of work on the route and the finishing time of work on the route were recorded into an indicator called total time worked. However, let's imagine that the management of our company has decided to change the way in which the hours worked by the employees are recorded. Starting from tomorrow, instead of recording both the starting and the finishing time of work on the route, this indicator object will record only the duration of work. Of course, we need to make this change in such a way that we won't lose all the previous data that is already in the database. In addition, the management gave us a task to change the way in which the health of the employees is tracked. Previously, we logged only two parameters, pulse rate and blood pressure. However, starting from tomorrow, our boss asked us to also log the result of the breathalyzer test, which is a test for alcohol, and the body temperature measurement. At the present moment, we already have an executable model of a business process that is called Managing the Vehicle on the Route, version 3. This version number is the version of the business process. We also have an object. It's an object of type card, and it's called Duty Allocation List, version 5. Because we will need to modify the indicators that are present in the business process. Therefore, we will need to create another version of this business process, and we'll give it another version number. Let's first start by modifying the indicators. Okay, so we have an object called Duty Allocation List. This Duty Allocation List object holds a card that is called Timetable for a group of crews. Because the card timetable for a group of crews is not the only object that has a total time worked indicator attached to it, let's create a new total time worked indicator. Let's create a new object and call it indicator total time worked by a group of crews. It's an object of type card. Uh, then let's design this object. By designing, I mean let's create a new version of it. So far it has no saved versions. Let's move on and design the version of this object. This indicator must contain the duration of work on the route, which is a property of type time. So we insert schedule duration and actual duration and the deviation of duration. In this case, we don't need anything else. Let's save the new version of this indicator. Now we go into designing the identifier. We will use schedule duration as an identifier for this object. Let's save the new version. Let's check that the new version is set as an active version starting from November 21st, 2012 until January the 1st, 2100. We also need to redesign the health status indicator. We select this indicator using the quick search for a string. Then we go to the designer application to create a new version. The designer application provides such a function as designing a new version of an object by copying and editing an existing version. So let's use this function. We are copying the previous version. What we've got here is date and time. This is a timestamp showing when the corresponding health parameters were logged. Also, we have health parameters themselves. These are pulse rate and blood pressure. We need to add body temperature and the result of the breathalyzer test. These properties have never been created before, so we need to create them. We select numeric as their type and save these properties. In addition to that, it will be good if in the structure of the object there is such a property as a comment. This is a field where a doctor can specify any additional data about the health status of the employee that goes to the route. Now let's save this newly created version. we move on to designing the identifier. We'll use the date and time properties as an identifier. We insert two spaces between these properties, and then we save the new version of the object. Because the indicators have changed, we now need to redesign the objects to which these indicators are attached. That is, the health status indicator was attached to the employee's health status card. This object contained a reference book called Description of the Health Status, which showed the final decision of the doctor about whether the employee is allowed to work on the route. Let's redesign this object. Let's make a new version of this object by copying an existing version. And here we see that after we have created a new version of this object, the subordinate indicator has also been updated and now uses the last version that we have just created. The card called Health Status is attached using a one-to-many relationship to the card called Time Worked by the Employee. Now we need to redesign the Total Time Worked by the Employee card. For this we will use an existing previous version. Let's make a new version. Let's now look at the structure of the new version of this object and check that the version of the subordinate object has also been automatically updated. Further, we will need to modify the Total Time Worked by the Crew card. Just as we did it before, we will similarly use an existing previous version. We make a copy of it. The system automatically takes the most recent versions of all the subordinate objects. Let's save this object. we add properties to the structure of the identifier. Now we need to redesign the object called timetable for a group of crews. We will also use the existing previous version, and we'll attach the new indicator for the total time worked by a group of crews. As a result, we have a new version of the object called timetable for a group of crews. This new version has a modified indicator of the health status in the health status card and a new indicator of total time worked by a group of crews that has been modified according to the request of our management. As far as the object have changed, we also need to modify the input forms that are used in the business process. That is, the health status card has changed. There used to be a card of version 1, and now we need to change the input form to work with the new version of the health status card. The input form is generated automatically. We enter the description below and press the Create button. We display all the fields of the automatically generated form. We need to hide those fields that the user mustn't see. We hide these two properties. We can see what the form will look like. We can also set the access parameters, such as filling in is required, filling in is not required, or read-only access is provided. Besides, we can create any calculated field, but in this case we don't need that. We also need to redesign the input form for the object called total time worked by the employee. Primarily, we need to redesign the form that the doctor will use. The form is generated automatically. We hide the fields that are not required for the doctor. We go to the tab called Inserted Tables, and for the Health Status object, we choose the new input form that uses the last version of this object. The doctor only needs the data related to the health status. This is why we hide the data called type of worked and hours worked. We hide the unnecessary fields. We need to understand that the input forms for the planner and for the dispatcher need to be different. Therefore, we first need to create a form for the planner and then a form for the dispatcher. The planner can see the card about the hours worked. However, he can only see the fields that contain the scheduled values. He cannot see the health status card. Therefore, we hide the fields that contain actual values and the fields that show deviation of actual values from the scheduled values. Besides, there is a table of solutions that matches the employee's full name with the employee's ID number, and a table of solutions that matches the employee's full name with the employee's position. Let's design an input form that the dispatcher will use at the sending to the route step of the business process. The dispatcher needs to see the data about the health status before he can send an employee to the route. The dispatcher must have read-only access to this information. The dispatcher also must see the scheduled times. Therefore, we choose the input forms that use the last versions of the objects, and we display all the fields. Here we can set a read-only access to the scheduled values. Furthermore, this form must not display deviations. What we get is the form which displays the data about the health status and the hours worked by the employee. We also need to redesign the input form for the object called time worked by the bus crew, which joins together the employees that work on the same bus and presents them together to the doctor. Let's create a form, an input form for the doctor. We hide the indicators on the main table, and we choose the required form for the employee in the tab called Inserted Tables. Let's create an input form for the planner. In this case, we only leave the fields that describe scheduled values. And into this input form for a bus crew, we insert an input form for an individual employee. Then we create an input form for the dispatcher, who is responsible for sending buses to the route. In this form, dispatcher will see the fields with scheduled times as read-only fields, and he will enter the actual time. We hide the deviation values so that they aren't shown on this form. We also insert the form for an individual employee and hide the unnecessary fields. As a result, we get a card that looks like this. Now, let's design an input form for our top object, called timetable for a group of crews. We will work with the timetable for a group of crews via the input form, which belongs to the duty allocation list object. The object called timetable for a group of crews is linked to this form using a one-to-one relationship. This is why we need to redesign the duty allocation list object. Let's make a copy of the previous version of the duty allocation list object. This also creates new versions of all the subordinate objects, which are so far identical to their previous versions. Let's look at the subordinate objects that we have here. Here we have a bus schedule, a timetable for a group of crews, and the work log of the vehicle. The duty allocation list object does not contain any indicators because all the indicators are attached to the subordinate objects. Let's save this new version of the duty allocation list. The identifier of this object's instances will contain such properties as the time of the last update, the document number, and the name. Let's first create a form that the doctor will use. In this case, the indicators on the main table mustn't be displayed. And on the Inserted Tables tab, we set the time worked by the crew card as editable. Then we select an input form for the doctor. Here in the table, we also hide the unnecessary fields. Now let's create an input form for the duty allocation list object for the planner. We hide the fields that are not necessary for the planner. Now we need to work with the inserted tables. We hide the values that show actual time. The scheduled duration of the trip is a calculated field. To make such a field, let's subtract the scheduled starting time of work from the scheduled finishing time of work. This formula should now appear in the list of formulas, and we assign it to the corresponding calculated field. We will now create two more forms for the dispatcher. One form for the step when the dispatcher is sending the bus to the route, and the other form for the step when the bus is working on the route. Forms for these steps of the business process have changed because the health status indicator has been modified, and also the indicator of total time worked by a group of crews has been modified. For the bus's round-trip schedule, we will use the form that was created for the last version. And for the time worked by the crew, we choose an input form for the dispatcher for the step of sending a bus to the route. Then we create an input form for the dispatcher, which he will use for the stage when a bus is already working on the route. In this case, we can create all the formulas which are required. For example, the scheduled duration of the vehicle's work on the route. However, for the scheduled duration, we don't need to calculate it here because it's already calculated in the planner's form. But we will need a formula that will calculate the deviation of the actual starting time of work from the scheduled starting time of work, and also another formula for the deviation of the actual finishing time of work from the scheduled finishing time of work, and also a formula that will calculate the deviation of the actual duration of work on the route from the scheduled duration of work on the route. Let's now create these formulas. The actual finishing time of work on the route minus the scheduled finishing time of work on the route is the deviation of the finishing time of work. And the third, the actual duration of work minus the scheduled duration of work equals the deviation of the duration of the vehicle's work on the route. We save all these formulas and assign them to the corresponding fields. Deviation of the starting time of work, deviation of the finishing time of work, deviation of the duration of work. Furthermore, we have another parameter that stores the deviation of the duration of work of the whole group of crews. Thus, by designing the input forms, we have actually connected all the forms in the system with each other. We have designed the final input forms that will be used in the business process. We can look at them. We can look at the required latest version. What is now left is now we need to design the business process. Let's sort all the business processes by their name. What interests us is the business process called managing the vehicle on the route. Let's design the same business process. The only difference will be that there will be one more decision maker involved in this business process, the doctor. We create a new version of this business process, managing the vehicle on the route. This will be already version 4. Let's set 10 hours as the total time given for completing this business process. we have created a new version of the business process called managing the vehicle on the route. Let's add a new responsibility center. That means a new step in the business process. Let's call it control the indicators describing the health status. The executor of this step is the doctor. We select an object called duty allocation list version 6, and we select a card that will be accessible for the doctor. Let's now change the version of the object that the business process uses to version number 6. Now we need to create a link between two steps in the business process. This will be an unconditional link. And here we create a link that is controlled by a condition. If the scheduled starting time of work is more than a time constant. And for the dispatch of the vehicle to the route, let's create a link that transitions the business process to work on the route if the actual starting time of work is greater than or equal to the scheduled starting time of work. For the link to the end of work on the route step, we create a condition that will activate the link. The condition is the actual finishing time of work must be equal to or greater than the scheduled finishing time of work. So we have designed a new version of this business process. It has not been saved yet, but we can save it and check how this business process works when we run it.